Welcome to the PI panel, Hanging Out Your Shingle, How Glamorous is the Life of a PI. And today, as you can see from all of their names on their pictures, we've got Tracy Clark, Matthew Goldman, James Hanna, Paul Marks, and Alex Segura. And Holly West is hanging out with us as well. As we go, if you've got questions and you want to throw them into the chat window, that's fantastic. I'm going to kind of keep an eye on it. Holly's going to watch it too. We are also going to have a Q&A at the end. We'll leave time for you guys to be popping stuff up in that chat window. But feel free to throw your questions up as we go. I don't do bios as moderator. Those of you who've seen me before, we're just going to launch right in. But I thought we'd start with something a little bit fun to remind everybody that writers are human. We all have our little quirky things going on in this crazy situation. So I would love to hear with every panelist, and I'll go down and ask by name so we don't have that awkward talking on top of each other that Zoom creates. What skills or hobbies might you be working on during the pandemic that you weren't doing before? Or are you doing nothing different and you've become a total couch potato? Personally, I'm baking a lot. I bake so much right now. It's crazy. So let's start with you, Tracy. You got anything crazy going now?
No, I just sort of discovered in the last 6 or 7 months which room is not my room, and that's the kitchen. I don't know what goes on in there, but apparently it's not my forte. I have cut myself. I have now resorted to just using the microwave, just slitting stuff in there, and that's good to go. I can't figure out measurements, timing, mashed potatoes get done before the meat that gets done. It's just too much. So is sort of a quarantine. It's off to the side, and I have discovered that in the last 6 or 7 months. That is not my area.
I love it. Sometimes it's good to figure out what you're not good at, right? Matt, what about you? Oh, more doggos. Love your dogs.
2 dogs. I have always wanted to learn how to play mandolin, so I got a mandolin and I'm slowly learning.
Fantastic. I love that. That's wonderful. Yeah. We'll have to get you to serenade us on another event.
That won't be happening.
James, what about you?
I've been trying to get back into running. I did that for a little bit, and I have a 10K coming up in 3 or 4 weeks, and it's absolutely miserable. So it's going to be terrible. And I bought a rowing machine because it was miserably hot during the summer, and I still wanted to exercise. And my efforts have been mostly to make sure it's not a $400 clothes rack.
I have one of those, so I feel for you on that one. Well, cool. Good luck on that 10K. Paul, what about you?
Well, to be honest with you, my life isn't all that different because I work at home and I have more time to write. I was hoping I'd have more time to walk. I live in kind of a rural, semi-rural area, and I was hoping I'd have more time to walk the dogs, but it's been so smoky lately that until the last few days, I haven't really been able to do that. But like Matt, I didn't have to buy them, but I have a couple guitars, and I've been trying to hone my skills, shall we say.
Great.
It's been a long time.
Excellent. We'll get you two to do a duet at some point. Alex, what about you?
Well, I also started out trying to get into running, but quickly gave up, and I've spent my time getting into cooking. It's really useful with 2 little kids, so you just kind of get creative. And I was never a recipe person, but now I've been spending time with we're vegan, so it's kind of a fun thing to do, and it's definitely stress relieving, which I wasn't expecting.
Oh, nice. That's good. See, there's a benefit to all this cooking and baking, right? It certainly lowers my stress. All right, I've got some specific questions for each of you, so I'm gonna go in reverse here and start with Alex. Your Pete Fernandez series, the most recent being Miami Midnight, correct? It's called noir, and it's compared to Pulp Fiction, and I'm wondering, what do those categories mean to you? What can writers expect from those subgenres?
Well, that's the first time I've heard the Pulp Fiction comparison, but I will happily take it. For me, my definition of noir, I think noir is a term that's kind of overused in a lot of ways. I think people just conflate it with mystery, and they're actually different for me. I mean, noir to me is you find someone at the end of their rope. You put regular people in really challenging situations, and they kind of wallow in the gray areas of life. You see people make bad choices and kind of face the consequences of those bad choices, and they don't always end on a good note. In fact, most of the time they end on a bad note. So for Miami Midnight, in terms of Pete, you really do see him at his lowest point, which is saying a lot considering it's the 5th book in the series, and it's a series of low points for him. But it is really about him crawling out of that ditch and trying to find a new normal. And it's the capper to the whole series. So hopefully it pays off on like the threads that have been building from the beginning.
Very cool. I like your definition a lot. Paul, your work is also called noir. Including your most recent novel, The Blues Don't Care. I think I have that correct, your most recent novel. What drew that to your style, and would you add anything or change anything to Alex's definition?
I think to me, I agree with Alex when he says that the noir label is kind of pasted onto everything. It's kind of like people think if they call it noir, it's going to sell or attract a certain audience.
I wish.
I don't know that The Blues Don't Care is so noir, but my Duke Rogers series of White Heat and Broken Windows is more on the noir side. And my definition of noir, along with what Alex said, is I see it as somebody tripping over their own Achilles heel from some kind of want or greed or some flaw that they have that causes them to kind of go in a direction that they wouldn't normally go. If you look at the Fred McMurray character in Double Indemnity, he's a normal guy. He's an insurance salesman. If he hadn't met Barbara Stanwyck, he probably would have stayed, kind of a normal, boring guy. So it's whatever weakness you have that drives your character to go to those depths.
Cool, interesting. And those your definitions work together and are also a little bit different than we often hear. So that's great. Tracy, you write the Cass Rains PI series. Your most recent is What You Don't See. What was it about the PI genre that spoke to you as you began crafting your series?
I think it was sort of the outsider sort of character, that person who sort of is not quite in society, but sort of to the side of it. Somebody who has their own code of conduct and honor, but wants to see justice done. When I sort of picture Cass, I pictured her as that kid who sort of ran with scissors and colored outside the lines and did all of those things that were unconventional in a conventional time. So she's sort of doing her own thing, making sure that justice is done, but doing it in a way that sort of is more solo and more personal to her. So that's what I was sort of drawing on when I started writing it. I wanted her to be inside and outside of society, a little bit outside of it, not quite in step with everybody else, but sort of going to the beat of her own drum. And that has sort of propelled me through the first 3 books. And I sort of like that outsider thing. So that's what it was. That's what drew me to the PI genre, because that was sort of one of the conventions of PI fiction. This sort of wayward character, sort of doing his own thing, skulking in the alleys. He's awake when everybody else is asleep when everybody else is awake. And so I wanted that sort of feel. So that's what I was going for.
Well, I love that. And that's actually a great segue into the question I have for James. So I'm going to switch my order up here. James, you're also intrigued by the idea of private investigator as outsider. You've got that in your Henry Malone series, which is now up to book 5, Behind the Wall of Sleep. I think I have that right. Fantastic. And I love that concept too. I'm on board with both of you. So what does that mean to you about being an outsider? What draws you to that kind of character?
Well, what's always made the PI novel interesting to me is he's always inherently sort of an external force. Whereas like with police procedurals, the idea is always you're trying to reinforce sort of the quote unquote moral code or whatever the societal code is. You're enforcing the law as opposed to what could be, sometimes PIs get to enforce a kind of a form of justice. It's almost karma on a certain level. And that was something I, have tried to, I played with a little bit because my character Henry Malone is a former West Virginia state trooper, and so he sees it from, he sees all of these circumstances from very different, from both sides of the coin, so to speak. And I wanted to see how far I could push him outside of everything he thought he felt and knew as a cop into, doing what's not the legal thing, but could be viewed as the right thing.
Right. That's a really fascinating distinction. I write both private eye and police procedural, and I've never thought about the fact that my PI is always thinking about when she's breaking the law and like how she cannot cross that line, and my sheriff is always thinking about how she can cross the line and not like that's a really interesting distinction. I'm going to have to think about that, how that plays that out in my own work. Matt, you write for TV as well as for novels. It sounds like you're pulling back a little bit from writing for Hollywood, including your latest novel, which is Dead West. Which life is more glamorous, being a novelist or being a television writer? What do you think?
Neither, really. Anybody who thinks being a Hollywood writer is glamorous doesn't know a Hollywood writer. It depends what your personality is like. If you like being around show business and you like being around a production with a couple hundred people on it and other writers all the time, I guess that is, I find being a novel writer more glamorous. I'm completely independent. I don't have to talk to anyone. Like people ask me how often I talk to my editor, and it's like almost never, until there's a book there. I guess my definition of luxury is being a novelist. It is, I am with my thoughts all day. I am not managing other people's creativity. In television, you're surrounded by really smart and talented people, but it's just human nature that everyone has a slightly different vision when an idea is pitched. When if you go into a network and you pitch out an idea, every single one of those executives gets an idea in their head of what that script is going to look like and what that show is going to look like. And it's nobody's fault. But you most likely are not going to deliver what's in their head. Right. Because when something's executed on the page, it's different than how something is sold. And so that just leads to disappointment. And it's hard to hold on to a voice through the process of developing a script and producing it. And with the book, it's not. One way I describe it is when you write a script, you're handing a blueprint in for what a house is going to be, but somebody else is going to decorate it. Someone else is going to choose the exterior. Someone else is going to make a lot of decisions. When you write a book, it is the house. That's it. It's done. Yeah.
That's really beautiful. And I had never thought about glamour in the sense of that ability to have independence, right? Like that's
if you like to go to fancy parties, be a Hollywood writer.
Right. I don't do well at fancy parties. Yeah. I can't dress like a grown up. So I guess I'll stick to being a novelist.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, this is going to be for all of you. I'm going to just go down the row the way I see you on the screen, which is, do you have a favorite fictional PI? The way I would answer that question, I'll give you guys a second to think about it. I don't know if it's my favorite fictional PI, but I was really impacted by James Rockford and the Rockford Files because that was what I watched as a kid with my granny, and we always watched those. And so he had an influence on sort of how I saw Private Eyes as being that outsider, right? Living in the trailer on the beach and kind of the type of personality, and that's carried over into my work. So Alex, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to go down the row. Do you have a favorite fictional PI?
I do. The problem is it's not just one. There's like a handful that I kind of go back to always. The book that made me want to write the Pete Fernandez books was a firing offense, George Pelicanos' first Nick Stefanos book, because it was just about a regular guy who gets pulled into this case and is completely ill-equipped to do that. And then if I had to choose another one, it would probably be Larry Block's Matt Scudder, just because of the duality of not only the case and the story, but his quest for sobriety and then staying sober and the whole recovery process, which was a huge influence on the Pete books. And Tess Monahan, I can't talk about PIs without Tess Monahan. She's just fantastic. So
that's a great list. I'm okay with more than one.
Okay.
Tracy, what about you?
It's kind of sort of like trying to name your favorite kid.
Hard.
I have so many favorites. I guess my first really one that I sort of latched onto, I guess, in 1982 was V.I. Warshawski, Sarah Paretsky's, and then of course Stuart Grafton's Kinsey Milhone. So those sort of got me into the genre or the subgenre. And after that, I mean, every PI that I've ever read, Pete Fernandez, I love. Sorry that there aren't any more. There's just so many PIs that I love and would actually read over and over again. So all of them. But those are my
Excellent.
spirit animals.
I love that.
Everybody else.
Paul, what about you?
Well, my first real exposure to them in book form were the classics like Lou Archer and Philip Marlowe. So I would have to say those two. Marlowe is the tarnished angel kind of guy trying to do right in a rotten world. And I like the Lou Archer stories because of the psychological aspect and how they always kind of twist back on themselves. There's always something in the present that's informed by what happened in the past, and it comes out. It's like you can't hide from your past. So I would have to go, I know they're not real original, but, like you with your Rockford story, these are the ones that turn me on to the whole genre, so I owe them something.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes it's not even the best. It's just that there's a personal resonance for you, or there's a history for you that makes them stand out. I totally get that. James, what about you?
Well, this is where I say, obviously, all the other panelists.
You sweet man, you.
But so I think, like the biggest influence would have to be Robert B. Parker, the Spencer novels. I forget who said it. There are two types of PI writers: those of us who admit that we're influenced by Parker, and the others who just lie about it. Lauren Estelman, the Amos Walker novels. I think that's one of my absolute favorite series. Obviously, Sue Grafton, Kinsey, and I lived, and she, lived in Louisville. So there's the shadow of that.
Yeah.
And a writer who I don't think gets talked about as much anymore, but Robert Campbell, the Whistler novels.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really great underappreciated series.
Nice. Matt, what about you?
I hope nobody can hear my dog coughing. Not coughing, but like has something in her throat. She's fine. But I hope she's not interrupting. It's definitely Philip Marlowe for me, which, sorry to be boring, but when I was wanting to figure out how to write fiction, I came to him very late. And when I read this point of view with a lot of social commentary, and that was brilliantly funny, that felt really inspiring to me. And like the other panelists have mentioned, that I'm so attracted to a counterculture figure, and that's what the PI often is. And that ability to not only get to the truth, but want to get to the truth regardless of what damage you create to yourself along the way is really attractive to me.
Right.
So, but again, I like a lot of them, but Marlowe's the one who stands out the most.
Yeah. And there is something about the PI as like, if they're doing their job right, everybody's angry at them, right?
Yeah.
Like, like, you know, the client is mad and the police are mad and, you know, whoever's guilty is mad. Like, they kind of piss off everybody, right? There's something sort of satisfying about those characters that are, if they're doing their job right, no one's happy, right? In a sense, often happens. James, you and I both write about rural communities. What are the pros and cons of that? What draws you to these rural communities? I'm curious if it's similar to mine.
Well, so it's interesting to me because it partially goes back to that idea of the outsider and the external force. Well, when, you know, my books take place in Parker County, West Virginia, which is not by accident. And they, you know, the thing with Appalachia is it can be very insular. And so when you're, you know, take this character who's supposed to be, you know, an external force, but everybody kind of knows who he is. It creates a different set of circumstances. So it's sort of being that outsider without the real opportunity to be an outsider. So, but I also like, you know, playing with, you know, the ideas of, you know, not a closed off culture, but, you know, sort of a much more, you know, rural, like you said. The downside to it is you start running out of potential clients.
Yes.
There's only so many people who can really pay for a private eye.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
And how much crime can you get away with in a small town, right?
Well, I mean, they were killing off people in Cabot Cove for years.
Right. Yes.
So,
I have not yet topped the Cabot Cove dilemma. Excellent. And also, do you also find that it's useful that you can kind of work around technology a little bit of cell phones going out and, you know, sort of not having that, well, they could just pick up the phone and call 911. Like, you can kind of get away a little bit with a little more. Do you find that to be true?
completely. I mean, like, I know where I grew up, there is like one cell phone provider. You cannot get like AT&T and Verizon in that entire town.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's impossible to make a phone, you know, just so the ability to be able to shut off, you know, those technological aspects, those things that would really make things simpler. And it just, you know, you really can't put the screws to your characters.
Yeah. 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 I think it's a real advantage. Matt, you've got 4 successful books under your belt. How much did you know in advance the arc that your private eye was going to take over those 4 books? Like, how did that evolve? Did you sort of write that first book and then for the second be like, oh, he's got to change, you know? Or did you have sort of a picture of how your character was going to evolve over those books?
I had a feel, really. I didn't know all the details at all or anywhere. I don't know all the details of chapter 2 when I started writing chapter 1. But I just had a feel for where he was, and I had to back him up in his personal life to a place I wanted him to grow out of. So, but I knew I wanted him and the other characters around him I wanted their lives to be in motion. I didn't want it to be the same characters with the same fall in love, relationship doesn't work out at the end, move on to the next thing, the next book. And so I really, all I knew was I wanted to arc him and keep him moving forward and also make him a person of his time, if not more emotionally intelligent, then aware that that's a good thing and striving for it.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. And all of you are writing some series, so I'd be curious how the rest of you would answer that. Tracy, what about you? How much did you know about the arc for Cass?
A little bit. When I started the first book, I wanted to put her in as deep a hole as I could possibly put her. So then the process becomes climbing out of that hole, one fistful of dirt at a time. It doesn't change a great deal in each book. It's just incrementally learning to sort of deal with her life, getting out of this hole that I put her in, how she sort of greets the world from a place of isolation and pain and what she does with that. So that's the arc of her character, and it sort of plays out over the 4 books so far, to see what she does with that. I mean, how much does she grow? What does she not learn? What are her flaws, and how does she sort of fight against those? So all of that conflict sort of carries through book by book. But I knew a little bit about that when I started the first one. I learned a little bit more when I started the second. And as I approached the third and the fourth, I kind of knew where it was going and how much she would sort of stretch herself as the series progressed. So you instead of learn along with the character as the writer. Every book sort of presents its own sort of problems and conflicts that you have to sort of figure out. So yeah, so a little bit I knew, the rest of it I sort of had to find out for myself, just as she did.
Nice. Alex, what about you?
I have to apologize if you hear children screaming in the background. Those are my kids.
It
But,
just adds
it's
a little bit of a sound effect.
They're fine. You know, I knew I wanted to tell the origin of the PI, which is something you don't really see that much, how a person becomes a private eye. So I knew there was going to be an endpoint once Pete became an official PI. But the first book I wrote, Silent City, I just wanted to see if I could write a book. And it was very much a love letter to the genre and kind of flipping the tropes that I wanted to flip. Like I really get frustrated by the idea of the hard drinking PI, or the concept that you can knock back a bunch of martinis and still save the day. So I just wanted him to have momentum and to really like evolve from book to book and have each book feel like a different season. And so you kind of collect these storylines, and it culminates in the 5th one. But I didn't have an idea that it was going to be 5. You know, I started with 1, like I hope I can finish 1. Then, you know, I wrote the 2nd one, and by the 3rd one I was like, well, it's not a trilogy. And then I kind of figured out it would be 5. Once you kind of just know when the ending's there, or at least the ending for now. You know, I was pleasantly surprised when people were frustrated that I'd announced Miami Midnight was the end. So maybe they'll do more.
Have to resurrect them. I'm curious, you also write comic books, correct? Is that part of why you're interested in origin stories?
Yeah, that was part of it. I mean, yeah, it is definitely part of that. I think with all the big iconic characters, you have that kind of main origin story, like Batman or Superman or Spider-Man. And I you know, the one thing you never see with Marlowe or even Lou Archer or these classic PIs is you get little tidbits about what they did before. You know, Lou Archer was a cop, you know, Marlowe was a cop, and there's some backstory, but they're not it's not one ongoing thread. It's very episodic. So I wanted to have that momentum of, you know, Pete kind of collecting these barnacles and these scars, and by the end of it he kind of hits this wall, and you know that's it for now.
Nice. Interesting. Paul, what about you and the evolution of your characters?
Well, when I first wrote White Heat, I thought it was going to be a standalone. So I didn't think about the arc in any kind of, you know, major way. You know, I had the arc for the actual novel, but I didn't have an arc to go over, you know, several books. And I had an agent at the time who wanted me to do a sequel, and I kind of balked at it because I didn't want to get tied down to being, you know, kind of typecast with one character and one story. But I listened to what she said, and I ended up writing the sequel. But, you know, you have to kind of go, okay, what do I do now, since I wasn't planning to do it? And my series takes place in the 1990s. And the first book takes place during the Rodney King events. So the kind of logical thing was, what is the next big thing that I could do? So for Broken Windows, in California, we had a proposition called Proposition 187, which was a anti-illegal alien proposition. And so the second story takes place around that. And you do see the characters grow a little bit. The main character in the books is Duke Rogers, and he considers himself kind of a screw up because his dad looks at him that way. And he did screw up a case in the first book. In The Blues Don't Care, which just came out, this one is set in the 1940s. And the main character in that wants to play with one of the jazz bands on Central Avenue in Los Angeles, and had no idea of becoming a private eye, and really isn't, although the arc is there in the story that he can become one in another book. So it's kind of there in the seeds of it. I also have a series running in Ellery Queen magazine, the Howard Ham Ghost of Bunker Hill series. And again, in the first story, The Ghost of Bunker Hill, I had no idea I was going to do a second one, but it was popular. People liked it. So you kind of scramble and try to, go on, on the move and do the best you can. So, you figure it out kind of from the back end to the front and work backwards.
But interesting, because yours are almost evolved through the era and events of the era, as opposed to just going straight from inside character.
Well, I think the era definitely plays into the stories. Like in The Blues Don't Care, the 1940s home front in Los Angeles is definitely, a character in itself in the book. And Los Angeles of that era is definitely a character. So that affects how the characters move and grow and that kind of thing. Same with the Duke Rogers book set in the 1990s. I like to anchor them in kind of real events, things that are happening, at the time.
Great, interesting. James, how about you? How is your characters evolving, and how much did you think about it ahead of time?
I didn't think the first thing about it, actually. when the book started out with the first book, this PI character, Henry was a very minor character actually in the book. And the book was intended to originally be a multi-character thing. And the case that he was dealing with was a very small portion of that was going to play into the rest of the story. And as I was writing the book, I just figured out I liked him more than I liked anybody else. And so that involved in me bringing him out and deciding to switch to that first person narrator. And I keep writing myself into these circumstances with the characters that I don't know how I'm going to get them out of. Not even within that book, but like by the next book, I'm like, okay, I don't know what happens. Like right now, I'm working on book 6 and have no idea how book 7 is going to play out. But I know that there's stuff that I'm laying in there, and I'll figure it out when book 7 rolls around, I guess. I hope.
Keeps life interesting, right?
That's a nice way to put it.
We have an interesting question in the chat window that I'm going to just throw out for all of you guys. Paul is wondering, do you like it better when the police, or that one police who might be working with the PI, that the police are sort of bumbling and that's why they fail, or when the police are almost as smart as the PI? Like, we do run into this issue, I think, when we're writing private eye, or people who are writing amateur sleuths, of why does our private eye solve a mystery that the police don't? And so I don't know how much all of your characters interact with the police, but how do you like that balance between the abilities that your PI brings to the table versus the police? Do they work with them? Are your cops not that smart? How do you navigate that particular thing? Anybody can just start speaking, or if you all start speaking at once, I'll have you throw a hand up. Any responses to that? It's a great question. Yeah, Paul, go ahead.
I think the reason is because the private eye can kind of skirt the law, where the cops, if they're being honest, if they're good cops, they have to follow the law. So they can't do the things that the private eye can do. I don't think the police in my books, there's not that much interaction. There is in The Blues Don't Care, but not in the Duke Rogers books so much. It's not that they're stupid or dumb or bumbling. It's just that they have to follow the law. And the private eye can do things, go places, talk to people, maybe strong arm people sometimes, that the cops can't do.
Interesting. Other responses? Alex, I saw you pop your mute off.
I try to be a thoughtful muter. Yeah, I think for Pete, it's definitely a very combative relationship. Most of the times the cops he deals with are very smart, but there's also an aspect of corruption to a lot of the Pete books, where he's dealing with some innate issue in the police department that's creating a problem where the police aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. But even the good cops find Pete annoying. The bad cops find him to be a threat. And so that's kind of a through line in all the books that you see. And even at the end in Miami Midnight, he finds this one detective who is helpful, but she still sees him as a pain. Like he's just, but he gets to do things that, like Paul was saying, he can do things that she can't because he's not bound by the law until he breaks the law. But yeah, it's definitely a combative and not a pleasant relationship, but I don't make them bumbling because I think that would be a disservice to the idea. Yeah.
Good. Anybody else? Yeah, Matt?
Yeah, I think the reality is, if you want to stick anywhere close to it, is that they can have a mutually beneficial relationship. I mean, the police have authority, the police have access to things like evidence lockups and databases that they can look up things. But they do have bureaucratic restraints. I mean, even a good street cop can only do what his or her commanding officer will let them do. And the PI doesn't have any bureaucratic restraints. And most of I would imagine most of our fictional PIs live a little bit more of a dangerous, on the edge life than a real working PI, because the stakes of losing your license for a real human being is pretty big. For a fictional one, we can deal with that. But yeah, I agree. Don't make them bumbling, but they can be restrained, and there can be all sorts of forces that are pointing them in the wrong direction.
Tracy, do you have some thoughts?
I agree with all of that. The police and the PI sort of have to be opposing forces, but it's sort of the rogue investigator against bureaucracy that we're sort of conflicting against. So it's that sort of their hands are tied by the law. The PI's hands are not, and that sort of to and fro, back and forth, is sort of what propels your story forward. So it's not so much that they're stupid; it's just that they have constraints that the PI doesn't have. So they're always sort of clashing against each other, and sort of getting it together eventually towards the end. But they're opposing forces. So yeah, I agree with all of that.
James, anything you want to add?
Copy all paste.
Copy all paste.
And I think it's important. I think it's important that it's like the Tarantino rule about don't have funny protagonists. Don't make your protagonist shouldn't sing bumbling. And on a certain level, with PI novels, the police play a sort of de facto protagonist sometimes. And when you make the police bumbling, then there's no real challenge. That lessens the challenge for your protagonist.
Yeah, excellent point. And I know for myself, I do a lot of research, and one of my experts is a homicide investigator. And I found all of my interactions and talking to him in the process so interesting that was part of why I ended up writing my next series as a sheriff as opposed to private eye, because I became so fascinated with the police procedures. And it is so different, but I throw her in a rural community where she doesn't have all the backup of a big police department, James. So you and I know how that works, right? She gets to have a little bit of flexibility because she doesn't have the same kind of backup. Excellent. Great question from the audience. Thank you. To go back to my list, we have a few more minutes before we're going to open it up to Q&A. Paul, you write historical novels, as we talked about, as you have referenced that. But what drew you to writing historicals?
Well, in terms of wisdom, one in the blue, that in the
Paul, you're cutting out. Is that just me? Have we lost Paul? Can I get a thumbs up if we've lost Paul from everyone else? Okay, Paul, I'm going to come back to you. Tracy, what do you think your main character, Cass Raines, brings to the genre?
I don't know. I think she stays pretty close to the PI convention, or what we sort of come to sort of know as a PI, classic PI. The difference is with her is that she's not sort of isolated so much. She has sort of a family unit. That's sort of a strange sort of dichotomy to sort of come with. She's solo in her job, but she sort of cobbled together this family that's not quite her family. So that's sort of, she's inside and out. So I think that's what she brings, the conventional and then the inventional, to sort of create sort of a character that's sort of a little fleshed out, a little fuller than maybe a Marlowe or something like that. She's not all completely bourbon and gunfights and all the rest of that. She's got people who love her, people who she loves, people she's connected to, places that she is at home at, so I think that's what this sort of series brings to the convention of PI novels.
So she fits the trope, but she also
but she's a little
adds to the
outside
trope.
of it. She has that outsider thing, but she's sort of got a little family that she sort of created for herself. So she's inside and out, not fully in, not fully out. Kind of a weird sort of, thing, convention.
Nice. I like it. Paul, let's give you another try and see if your sound works. Talking about what drew you to historical.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay. In terms of The Blues Don't Care, the most recent book, which is set in the 1940s, I've always had a fascination with that era. I like the movies, I like the music. Obviously, film noir came out of that era. And I enjoyed doing the research. I enjoyed listening to the music. And in a sense, it's kind of easier to write that than it is to write my 1990s novels, because in the 1990s, you had a lot of the things that we have today, like cell phones and computers, but they were very ancient by today's standards. So you have to make really sure not to do that. But in the 1940s, it was like a different world. But again, it's the music, it's the era, it's the conflict going on. There's World War II going on in the background. There's racial issues going on in the background. My story takes place partly on Central Avenue in Los Angeles, which is the African-American kind of cultural center at that time. Lots of nightclubs, the Dunbar Hotel, which is where Black entertainers and politicians stayed when they couldn't stay in hotels in other parts of the city. So I find all of that really interesting. And I wanted to do a story set there. I wanted to do something because I enjoy that era. I know it had a lot of conflict and a lot of problems, but that also creates a lot of room for drama.
Nice. Before we open it up to questions, I've mentioned all of your current books that are out, but I'd love to just go down the row. Matt, I'm going to start with you. If you could let readers know what's next, what's coming out next, that would be fantastic. Matt?
What's coming out next is a book called Carolina Moonset. It is not in the series. It's a standalone. It's with Forge, and it'll be out in 2022.
Nice. James?
Sorry, I was unmuting. So I'm working
okay.
on number 6 in the Henry Malone series, Tombstone Blues. Hoping to have that out next year. And then I have a 70s rural set crime novel that I'm working on that involves moonshiners in Kentucky.
Fantastic. If you need a taste tester for that moonshine, I'm willing to,
I appreciate
take one for the team. Paul, what about you? What's next?
Well, as I said, The Blues Don't Care just came out a few weeks ago, so that's kind of the new thing, but I'm working on the 3rd in the Duke Rogers series. Doesn't have a title yet, but I'm pretty much 3/4 of the way through it, and it continues in the 1990s with another real event that happens. I also have a collection of short stories that I co-edited called Coast to Coast Noir, from Sea to Shining Sea. It's the 3rd in the series that I've done for Down and Out Books, collection of short stories that kind of takes place it starts on the West Coast with a story, and then each story moves further and further to the East Coast. And that just came out about a week ago. So cool. Those are what's happening for me.
Nice. Tracy, do we have another Cass Rains coming up?
Book 4 in the series comes out July of 2021. It's called Runner. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yay. Alex, what have you got coming up next?
Well, I wrote a Star Wars novel that came out in August. It was Poe Dameron Freefall, which is the origin story of Poe. And my next crime novel will be a standalone called Secret Identity. It's coming out from Flatiron Books. And it's about a woman moving from Miami to New York in the 70s to work in the comic book industry. And she gets caught up in a murder mystery that she has to solve to kind of reclaim the character she's created. So it's kind of, I put all my influences in the blender, and hopefully a good book will come out.
Fantastic. We have no doubt it will be. Okay, it's 3:45, so I have more questions, but I also want to open it up to the audience, and I have an audience question ready to go here. We have a question that says, I'm writing a 1950s noir detective novel, and my publisher says we need to make it accessible to modern readers and avoid the cliches from the 40s. How do you make sure the writing resonates with modern readers? Anyone can respond to this, but Paul, as our sort of historical writer, do you want to answer that first?
Well, there's a certain style to books that were written in the 1940s and 50s, and I think you want to avoid that style. I think in some senses it's more Baroque. You want it to be fast-paced. The one thing that I would recommend against is you don't want to put things in it from today that weren't around back then. We have a tendency to put modern attitudes into stories that were set in there. And, you have to be true to the time and true to the characters. And sometimes that can be unpleasant and insensitive to today's audiences. But if you want to make it real, I think you have to do that. But I think you can write it in a sense that's more modern. If you look at books from the 1800s, it's 500 pages before you actually get to the plot. So it's not that bad in the 1940s and 50s. But again, you want to get into it quickly. You want things happening right away.
So in a sense, you're keeping the world authentic, but how you structure a book might be a modern structure of a novel. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Right, and the writing style can be more modern too.
Anybody else want to respond to that question? Going once, going twice. I also think that there's, we have that ability if we're placing something historically that we can parallel or mirror events that were happening in the past that are happening now as a way to sort of explore things from a remove. I always think that that's sort of useful too. And going along with what you were saying, Paul, we may have to stay true to how things were seen back then, but we can be looking at, acknowledging, struggling with contemporary issues in that historical framework, which I think can be useful as well to connect with readers.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. It's also,
no, go ahead, Alex. Go ahead.
It's also whose eyes you see these things happening through. We're seeing a huge uptick and thankfully in diversity and diverse voices and diverse characters. And I think there's still room to go back and explore these different time periods from different viewpoints, and that will give you a unique story that does feel modern and is true to history, but gives you a perspective that you probably didn't see before.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, Alex.
I could just add one thing that is the way that I look at it, is the events that I deal with in these books set in the past are kind of a prism as to how to look at things that are happening today. And they give us a perspective that I think if you set the same story today, we wouldn't have. So they give us that perspective of distance where we can look at things and kind of see them, but also apply, kind of what we learned or something to what's happening today.
Excellent. Do we have any? Let's see here. I'm not seeing any other questions from the audience. Guys, feel free to write in if you've got anything you'd like to ask our panelists. I'm going to hit them with another one of my questions. Do your PIs have any unusual quirks or identifiers? Do they work with a dog? Do they have a hobby that they use in some way in their skills? Do they have any random skill sets? Would love to hear if there's something sort of identifiable for your characters. And I'm going to give that out to all of you. You can hop in or throw a hand up. Y'all are thinking? Yeah, Alex.
Sorry. I think for me, the reason I started writing the Pete books was because there wasn't a character like him. You know, there wasn't. I couldn't see myself. I couldn't see myself in the PI genre. Everyone was kind of. It was a lot of, you know, white male PIs, which is fine, and those are kind of the characters that establish the genre. But I wanted to see someone like me with the same background, and so it sounds trite to say that's an identifier. It's just who he is. It's part of his being. But he also has really good taste in music, so there's that as well.
I don't think either one of those are trite. I think they're both fantastic. Yeah. Anybody else want to address that one?
Well, Cass is addicted to cheeseburgers, if that counts for anything.
Part of what I love about her.
She's got her favorite spot in her favorite diner, favorite booth in the back. That's a quirk. You know, other than that, she's normal.
Anybody else? All right, we have a question.
All right.
Yeah, go ahead, Matt. No, go ahead.
No, you ask the question.
Matt, does your character have any quirks? We have another audience question. Any subjects that you won't write about? Always an intriguing question. Is there anything that goes a little bit too far? I can say personally, I can't do abuse to animals. I can't write about it. I don't want to read about it. I can kill children, and I'm not too bothered by it. But man, I can't really seriously endanger or hurt an animal. Any of you guys have anything that's sort of taboo for you or something you don't want to touch on?
I think child abuse would probably be one of mine. Animal abuse too. Any kind of abuse of innocence, I sort of steer away from. I think adults are fair game, and crime on the streets is fair game. But you know, those two subjects are something that I don't want to tackle at this point. Maybe I will further down the line, but right now, no.
Yeah. Anybody else? Alex?
Yeah, I mean, children, any kind of abuse with children as a dad to really small kids, it's not something that I think about. I want to include in my fiction. It doesn't mean I won't ever write about it, but I try to be judicious about violence in general. I think obviously we're writing crime and we're writing things that reflect the world as it is, but you can very easily step over that line where it becomes gratuitous and you're kind of doing it in a unhealthy way. So when I'm writing violence, I try to kind of make it a means to an end and kind of showcasing the problems with it as opposed to celebrating it, whether it's towards women or children or any kind of group that has been, you know, experiencing that for so long. Yeah.
Matt?
I agree about the violence. I think violence is like hops and beer. Like a little is okay, but some of it's out of hand. I'm not interested in writing about serial killers. And if any of you are, please don't kill me about that. But I'm interested in what makes a normally or otherwise healthy person get driven to that place, that they take that action. So not so interested in killing machines.
Yep. Paul?
I can't think of anything that I absolutely wouldn't write about if the context was right. But, you know, like others have said, child abuse is maybe something, you know, if you're going to do it, you know, maybe do it off screen, so to speak. If there is a child who's been abused, maybe you don't show it directly, that kind of thing. There's other things that I feel like I don't want to do, which is to show people exactly how to build a bomb if somebody's building a bomb, you know, things like that. So, you know, I might fudge on certain things, but I can't think of a topic that I absolutely would not write about. There might be one, but that just doesn't come to mind.
James, how about you? Is there anything that feels sort of taboo for you?
I don't know that there's anything that's taboo that I wouldn't. I think it always boils down to approach. I think about Jonathan Kellerman's Alex Delaware novels. in the first one, When the Bough Breaks, which tackles child abuse. And he does it in a really great manner that, I mean, is also horrific. You feel the weight of that. But I think he handled it so well. And this was in the 80s at a time where it wasn't a thing that was talked about.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it does boil down, for me personally, just how you handle it. Though a lot like Matt, I'm up to here with serial killers.
Yep, I understand that. We have another audience question. Do you ever find the conventions of the genre restrictive? Are there elements you wish you could add that are hard to fit in because of the sort of conventions of the genre that we're writing? Anybody want to speak to that one?
Not restrictive, but just sort of as foundational. I think it's just your starting point. The conventions of the PI novel are just kind of where you start. And then all the other stuff you add on yourself. So I don't find it restrictive at all. It's just sort of like a blueprint for development.
Matt, I saw you pop your volume off.
I agree completely that I don't find it restrictive in any way. My own writing ability is the biggest restriction. So, but not the genre.
That's beautifully honest. Alex, what about you?
Yeah, I have to just add to the chorus there. I think the PI genre gives you a template, but I mean, for me, the best crime fiction is kind of a peek into our world, and so there's so much ground to cover there. I try to treat each book as a standalone, and it's really whatever is obsessing me at the moment. I just throw Pete into it, whether it's a cult or organized crime or like human history. I think there's so much flexibility there that it's really just what you make of it. So, like Matt said, yeah, it's up to my ability if I'm up for it.
Paul, what about you?
I really don't think it's that restrictive, especially these days. I mean, you can do more, but a long time ago, I had a novel that I really liked that was kind of a private eye mystery, but it also had a sci-fi element. And an editor at one of the publishers wanted to do it, but she couldn't get the rest of anybody there to agree. So in that sense, I don't know how much cross genre. I think it's probably easier to do that today than it was back then. But mostly in terms of writing what I do right now, if I want to add a certain element, barring sci-fi, I pretty much do it.
James, anything you want to add?
I'm with everyone. I don't find the genre. I mean, someone said that the Western's the most flexible genre you can tell any story. And I really think, honestly, you can do that with PI novels. I think it really opens the door. And when you look at writers like Sarah Paretsky, Alex, Matt, Tracy, everyone on this panel, everyone, we're all writing in the same genre. What is typically the same genre. We are all writing very different books.
Yeah, right. And I would
flexibility that really tells you how broad the genre is.
Yeah, I agree with everybody. And I would say it's less about restrictions and more about there are conventions. And even within that convention, we can choose whether to play with it, whether to turn it on its head. And we sort of are acknowledging the type of books, the subgenre that we're writing, but also expanding it and making changes. We are almost out of time, so I'm going to hit a last couple questions here from the audience. Let's give a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Sex scenes in PI stories, yes or no? Thumbs up for yes, thumbs down, a little bit of iffy. Okay, nope. All right, so we've got 2 that are kind of on the edge and 3 of us that are like, woo, bring on the sex scenes. Another question is, has the pandemic impacted your writing schedule or your motivation? Let's do this because we're almost out of time. If you're being impacted, give me a thumbs up. Anybody been impacted by the pandemic? Alex, you were quick to thumbs up. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what that's been like?
Well, I think it just becomes a challenge of focus. I used to go into an office for my day job and then come back and write. And, it's now everything is remote and everything's at home. So it's just a matter of, it really kind of ramps up your discipline. So I have been as productive as before. It's just been a little bit more challenging. So it's just kind of being mindful of that.
Yep. Anybody else being impacted? Matt?
Just in the beginning, when the drama out in the real world overshadows what's in your head,
Yeah.
it throws you off a little bit. But then I got back to my normal schedule, and I've been that way since. I don't have young kids at home anymore. They're grown. Alex, I don't know how you do that. I didn't even
There's a lot
write
of
my first
screaming
novel
involved,
till they went to college. Yeah.
I totally agree. Well, guys, we're rolling up on 4 o'clock, and that is our end time. So I just like to take a quick minute. I want to thank Holly for being our fantastical technical host back there. Everyone at BoucherCon. For all of you out in the audience, thank you for being here. And everybody on this panel has books for sale. You can access them through their website or online from your favorite booksellers. Support your local independent booksellers, guys. We got to get everybody through this pandemic.
Yes.
Keep reading, keep writing, and I look forward to seeing y'all in person again soon.
Yeah.
It's a great panel,
Thanks,
you guys.
everybody.
Really good.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Have a great
Take care.
day.
Yay. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, guys.